part 1 of the video, we all know how the Americans turned Khe Sanh into a military wonder. Almost all the best things that could be brought to Vietnam, they brought to Khe Sanh. Khe Sanh Base is the area of Long Bay strongholds, Quang Hoa military subregion, and the center of the Ta Khon Airport defense stronghold. Khe Sanh's especially important position is like an anchor in the U.S. military map, especially threatening the Ho Chi Minh Trail and protecting the 1st Tactical Area. This is the command center of the McNamara family that the Americans built to cut off the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Only by destroying this stronghold can the Vietnamese People's Army remove the thorn that the U.S. intended to insert into this supply route. In today's Part 2 video, let's see the next developments of this war. Bringing tanks across Truong Son, the miracle of Dien Bien repeats. Determining this campaign was an extremely important battle. Not simply a strategic diversion in each 1968, but Khe Sanh was also determined by the Hanoi Politburo to hold back the main U.S. forces for as long as possible. The depletion of American forces caused the U.S. to get bogged down here. Obviously, the firepower from the U.S. Air Force in Khe Sanh was hundreds of times more terrifying than the French in Dien Bien. So at that time, repeating an overwhelming victory like Dien Bien was impossible for the Americans. So Hanoi chose a different way of fighting for Khe Sanh. Determining this was an important battle. The Democratic Republic of Vietnam sent strong forces to the battlefield, including the 304th, 320th, 324B, and 325th Infantry Divisions, 4 artillery regiments, 3 air defense regiments, and 1 armored tank battalion. The total force on the entire line was about 40,000 troops, of which the 304th and 325th Divisions, with a total of about 17,200 troops, encircled Khe Sanh. The 320th and 324th Divisions, with a total of about 16,900 troops, cut off Route 9, blocking the U.S. supply line. In this battle, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam switched from fighting mainly with infantry to combined arms. For the first time, many types of heavy weapons were used, especially the use of secret tank forces to suddenly attack and destroy the enemy. The first use of tanks in combat on mountainous terrain was a feat. After 50 days of marching, mainly at night, the Munner 98th Group brought 30 PT-76 tanks to travel more than 1,000 kilometers through 5 large rivers. The U.S. Air Force attacked the formation 15 times. Many components and ammunition of the tanks were carried on the bare feet of the laborers and were attached to bamboo rafts to cross rivers and streams to ensure secrecy and surprise. When crossing the Sepon and Sepangying rivers, each time more than 300 people had to be mobilized to build underground roads for the vehicles to cross the river. Bamboo was cut and broken to transport necessities and tank chains. Wherever the tanks went, the soldiers and people had to follow to erase the tracks of the tanks so that the enemy would not detect them. Hundreds of bamboo chutes were woven into fences and built on the tanks, which partly dissipated the heat generated by the machines, making it impossible for aircraft to detect them with modern means. It can be said that this was a miraculous journey that took place in 2 months, but the American Army did not detect it at all and ensured absolute safety. By the end of November, the battalion had reached the assembly point in Nam Cang, about 70 kilometers west of the Hoi San base, and when the campaign began, the American generals were completely surprised to hear that the Liberation Army had tanks participating in the battle. Just like the way the Viet Minh troops brought artillery to the border and fired straight into the Muang Thon Basin, this time, the Vietnamese created an extraordinary thing that the Americans could not believe when they brought tanks to the battlefield. In addition, the total force doing logistics work at the peak reached 7,624 officers, soldiers, and laborers. By the end of June 1968, the transportation forces had organized the transportation of 22,253 tons of reserves. With such material forces, the logistics forces had fully and promptly met all the material needs necessary for the campaign. Thus, both the Democratic Republic of Vietnam and the U.S. were ready for the war. Phase 1. Encirclement and isolation. In order to reach Kazang, the Liberation Army had to uproot the defensive bases in the north and northwest. On January 20th, the Liberation Army officially opened fire, opening the campaign. Hill 881 was chosen as the opening battle. Early in the morning of the 20th, a company of the 26th U.S. Marine Battalion stationed at Hill 881 was ambushed. Immediately, about 65 U.S. soldiers were eliminated from the combat room. The Vietnamese troops rushed to occupy the hill like a flood. The surrounding U.S. fire bases responded. Napalm bombs were dropped from the Air Force, preventing the Liberation Army's attacks. The U.S. Marines, heavily damaged, had to retreat to the south of Hill 881 and avoid fighting. A few hours later, another squad from Battalion 326 arrived by helicopter. A fierce battle broke out just north of Hill 881 with Battalion 6 of the 95C Liberation Army. The U.S. had to call in helicopters to provide fire support. The Liberation Army's attacks were forced to retreat and halt their advance. At dawn on the 21st, Battalion 6 of the 2nd Liberation Army also attacked Hill 8882 northwest of Ta Con Airport. The U.S. troops were entrenched in artillery fortifications from Ta Con, providing support. Although the Liberation Army also had artillery, they were forced to retreat when they could not destroy this stronghold. The Americans were temporarily reassured when they were able to protect the two strongholds that covered the central area of Khe Sanh. But they were wrong. Right at the time when the battle at Hill 882 was breaking out, the artillery of the 304th Liberation Army Division opened fire. This surprise attack lasted for a long time with great power, hitting many important targets in Khe Sanh and drilling many holes on the runway, blowing up the 1,500-ton ammunition depot, including 300 artillery shells. Destroying a helicopter, more than 50 American soldiers were put out of action. With most of the ammunition in the middle of the letter destroyed, the U.S. had to urgently mobilize helicopters to supply Khe Sanh on the 22nd. On January 23rd, the Khe Sanh Rote 9 Front Command ordered an attack to destroy the Hoi San stronghold located right below Viet Lao. At 7 p.m. on January 23rd, when the artillery fire suppressed and cleared the fortifications, the infantry and especially the tanks of the Liberation Army began to charge. The defenders here were completely panicked when they encountered the tanks of the Liberation Army. Supported by tanks, the infantry attacks quickly overcame the fortifications, penetrated deep into the enemy, destroyed the headquarters, occupied the targets, and suppressed all resistance of the Royal Lao Army units stationed there. By 8 a.m. on January 24th, about 800 soldiers were captured or killed. The rest fled to Lang Vei base. Also on the night of January 23rd, in other attack directions, the 320th Division also launched troops to destroy the Dong Ma and Cu Lin bases west of Khe Sanh. After 4 days of fighting, the 320th Division repelled many counterattacks by the U.S. troops, killing more than 200 U.S. troops and completely cutting off Route 9, creating conditions for the 304th and 325th Divisions to tighten the siege at Khe Sanh. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, the 126th Special Forces Group also completed its mission when it sank 6 LCU cargo ships in Dong Ha in 3 consecutive days from January 20th to 22. Then, in 3 days from January 26th to 28th, it sank 3 more LCU ships at Qua Viet Port while they were on their way to support Dong Ha. On February 8th, the 126th Special Forces Group sank 4 more American LCU ships. But the nightmare of the Americans was not over yet. On March 1st, the 126th Special Forces Group continued to sink 7 LCU ships and sank 5 more ships. This battle was considered the Bac Dang battle on the Hio River, causing panic among the Americans. The battle was the source of reinforcements by river from the east, isolating the central area. Khe Sanh became more and more dangerous. On February 5th, the Liberation Army continued to attack Hill 8882. Although they had broken through the enemy's defensive line, the Liberation Army's attack was still pushed back by the U.S. soldiers with the support of geomagnetic sensors. However, on February 6th, the Liberation Army used 11 PT-76 amphibious tanks to support the infantry in attacking the barracks of the U.S. Special Forces located southwest of the base and causing these bases to be leveled. And so, the strongholds on the northern side of Khasan were all completely destroyed by the Liberation Army. Only Lang Vei Base remained. The Front Command decided to concentrate its forces to repel Lang Vei. To win Lang Vei for sure, the General Command decided to use an overwhelming force consisting of 1 infantry regiment, 1 additional infantry battalion, 1 engineer regiment, 2 special forces companies, and 2 armored companies, including 14 PT-76 monsters. By 10 a.m. on February 7th, the Lang Vei battle ended. About 600 American and South Vietnamese troops were killed or captured. The rest fled to Khe Sanh. Thus, the last important stronghold on Route 9 was destroyed, pushing the Ta Khon stronghold into an isolated position, completely located in the middle of the Khe Sanh Valley. The pressure from the Liberation Army on Route 9 Khe Sanh increased, making the American General Command in South Vietnam really worried. General Westmoreland left Saigon for Da Nang to mainly respond. He quickly mobilized other forces here to reinforce. The U.S. combat troops on the entire front line had reached 43 standard battalions, including 25 U.S. battalions and 18 battalions of the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, with a total of 69,490 soldiers, including 40,800 U.S. soldiers. At this point, the Khe Sanh Route 9 front had completed its mission of attracting and holding back an important part of the U.S. Strategic Mobile Force, contributing to creating favorable conditions for both the North and the South to carry out the strategic attack on the Tet Offensive in 1968. As in Hue, the U.S. troops being mobilized from the city created conditions for the Liberation Army to quickly control 90% of the city in just 2 days. Phase 1 of the campaign ended here. Phase 2, the American Nightmare. After the extremely fierce developments in Phase 1, in Phase 2, the Liberation Army's main task was to encircle and put pressure on the main U.S. force to keep as much of the U.S.'s forces as possible here. The 304th and 325th Divisions quickly recruited troops and surrounded Khe Sanh Base in the north and northwest. Capturing the high points outside allowed the Liberation Army to place heavy artillery and fire directly at the central position of Khe Sanh. The U.S. Air Force tried to find ways to destroy the Liberation Army's heavy artillery positions. The Liberation Army responded by dispersing the positions of the artillery batteries from 100 meters to 300 meters apart, even up to 800 meters apart in some places. In addition, there were shelters available to pull the artillery into after firing. There were also anti-aircraft gun positions around. Therefore, the U.S. aircraft could not destroy the artillery of the Liberation Army. The U.S. Marine Corps' artillery was mainly 105 millimeters, which did not have enough firepower to return fire, and even the 175 millimeters artillery pieces located at Ta Khon and Cam Lo could not hit the heavy artillery pieces of the Liberation Army. The Vietnamese artillery pounded rockets and mortars on the heads of the U.S. troops in Khe Sanh every day, causing terrible pressure. Meanwhile, the 95th and 101st Regiments had also begun to divide their troops and occupy 3 high points, 845, 852, and 550, protecting Khe Sanh from the east and southeast. In all the directions they captured, the Liberation Army built solid trenches. After building a complete opposing position, the mortar and 12.7mm heavy machine gun positions began to attack the airport, causing American aircraft to encounter countless difficulties in supplying. The movement of the U.S. troops in the base was also controlled. Some were killed by snipers. At the same time, the infantry and encroachment forces also developed deeper and closer to the bases, with the land headlands encroaching through the second and third fences of the U.S. On February 10th, almost all the U.S. soldiers fell into a state of psychological crisis when a Marine Corps C-130 was hit by bullets and forced to make an emergency landing at Khe Sanh, killing 8 U.S. soldiers. At this time, the U.S. side did not know that the Liberation Army had reduced 1/3 of its troops in Khe Sanh to transfer to the Hue battlefield. The U.S. soldiers were still afraid that they would not receive supplies and that the casualties would not be transferred out of the battlefield. Basically, the Liberation Army's goal of holding back the U.S. had been achieved. To push the flow of liberation troops out of Khe Sanh, the U.S. used unlimited artillery and air power. From January 21st to March 3, 1968, the U.S. Air Force made 24,000 sorties, including B-52 strategic aircraft, dropping 140,810 tons of bombs of all kinds. This number is equal to the amount of bombs the U.S. dropped on all of Japan in the whole year of 1945. On average, each day the U.S. mobilized 32 B-52 sorties and 200 raid sorties to drop 1,800 tons of bombs. At the same time, artillery from the base fired 159,000 shells into an area of only 32 square kilometers around Khasan, creating fierce firestorms never seen before in the history of war. After the use of air force and artillery could not stop the development of the encirclement, the U.S. was forced to send forces from the base out to practice counterattacks, not allowing the encirclement to move far away and recapture some posts. Many battles took place extremely fiercely. Combined with the siege, the Liberation Army artillery continuously shelled, depleting the American troops. The climax was on February 23rd, when the shelling blew up an ammunition depot, killing 12 American soldiers and injuring 51. Recalling the siege at Khasan, veteran George Curzon is still haunted. "We were in the middle of small shelters. There were many bombs dropped, many people died and were injured. It was a very difficult time. We had no water and were in dire need of food, just trying to hold on for dear life. Even for clean water for drinking, daily activities and bathing, the U.S. had to use planes to drop supplies." There is a story told by the U.S. Marines during the Khasan battle. For many weeks, a Vietnamese sniper hid on a hill and fired at the U.S. base, causing some damage and restricting the movement of U.S. soldiers. The U.S. soldiers launched many patrols, including artillery fire, but still could not eliminate this sniper. Finally, the U.S. launched an airstrike with many planes and all kinds of bombs, from napalm to 20mm cannons, firing continuously for a long time until the entire hill became desolate. Faced with chemical weapons, even U.S. soldiers had to take shelter in trenches and personal bunkers. It seemed that nothing could survive. However, when everything was quiet, the sound of rifle fire rang out again. All the U.S. Marines in the base stood up and cheered to express their surprise and admiration for that Vietnamese soldier. After 2 months of siege, the fate of more than 6,000 U.S. soldiers in Khasan base was extremely miserable. However, at this time, fierce fighting was still happening throughout the southern battlefield, so the U.S. still could not send troops to relieve Khasan. On February 24th, U.S. forces attacked the artillery positions of the Liberation Army around Khasan with gas, smoke, high-powered artillery shells, and napalm bombs, allowing Sea-Night helicopters to fly into the rescue points on the hilltops and drop down electrical supplies. On March 22nd, the Liberation Army decided to launch a probe straight into Ta Khon Airport. A fierce battle broke out, with both sides shelling each other's positions. After many hours of fighting, the overwhelming U.S. firepower caused the Liberation Army to suffer casualties and be forced to retreat. The attack to capture a part of the front line in the east of Ta Khon Airport, although not yet successful, increased the already formidable pressure on the U.S. side. On March 30th, the U.S. side organized a counterattack outside, but after 5 hours of fighting, it also failed and suffered quite a lot of casualties. At this time, both President Johnson and the U.S. Congress were worried about the more than 6,000 U.S. troops who were besieged in the center of the sub-region at Khasan. The whole world was also anxiously waiting to see the developments of the Khasan battle. Faced with the risk of Khasan being destroyed, like Dien Bien Phu, President Johnson finally had to decide to send a very strong force to rescue Khasan. Phase 2 of the campaign ended, moving to Phase 3. At the end of Phase 2, the U.S. troops in Khasan were really in trouble before the stormy attack and the extremely overwhelming encirclement ability of the Liberation Army. Let's wait for the climax of the last 2 stages of this war in Part 3 of the video about Khasan.